Forget the shiny stone castles and fancy knights in bright armor. If you traveled back to England in 950 AD, you wouldn't find the romantic fairy tales. You'd find a tough world built on mud, hard work, and fighting, and you'd be standing right at the edge of history being made. Welcome to the real, amazing world of Anglo-Saxon England. The 900s and 50s weren't just another forgotten time in the so-called Dark Ages. This was the exact moment the idea of England truly came to be. For over 100 years, the Anglo-Saxons had been locked in a tough, never-ending fight against Scandinavian invaders. But the biggest historical turning point arrived right in this time period, specifically in 954 AD. That was the year the last Viking king of York, a famously fierce warrior named Eric Bloodaxe, was permanently kicked out and killed near Stainmore. With his death, the rebellious northern areas finally fell in line. And for the very first time, the entire country was officially united under a single Anglo-Saxon king, King Edred. But what did this newly created unified nation actually look like in real life? If you walked through it, the first shock to your modern senses would be the roads and buildings. You wouldn't be walking on smoothly paved streets unless you happened to stumble upon the crumbling, overgrown ghost roads left behind by the Roman Empire about 500 years before. Instead, the Anglo-Saxon world was naturally carved from wood, dirt, and straw. Most of the people lived in very isolated country farms or small villages, connected only by deeply rutted dirt paths that turned into impossible, knee-deep mud pits during the harsh English winters. However, if you wanted trade or protection and visited a burh, the fortified market towns first designed by King Alfred the Great to fight off Viking attacks, you would see a surprising level of city planning. Towns like Winchester or Oxford had well-organized grid systems surrounded by huge, impressive dirt walls and thick wooden fences. Inside these burhs, the streets were narrow, tightly packed, and sometimes laid with corduroy roads, split wooden logs placed side by side to lift carts above the mud. Yet, we must be very honest about what you would experience with your senses. It was overwhelming. There was no underground sewer system or modern plumbing. The center gutters ran thick with animal poop, butcher shop leftovers, and household trash, creating a strong, earthy smell that hung heavy in the damp air. Pigs, chickens, and hunting dogs roamed freely among the busy townspeople. The air vibrated with the clatter of wooden cartwheels, the rhythmic, loud ringing of the local blacksmith's hammer, and the noisy bargaining of merchants speaking thick, rough dialects of Old English. Despite this raw, rough environment, these people were not ignorant savages. They were skillful timber engineers and tough survivors, shaping a powerful society. They were literally laying the foundation for a unified kingdom, surviving brutal weather and political trouble alike. But if the streets were this intense, chaotic, and muddy, what on earth was it like when they finally went indoors to escape the cold? Stepping off the freezing, muddy streets of a 10th century burh and ducking through the low, heavy timber door of a typical Anglo-Saxon home was a total shock to the senses. Forget the multi-room, heavily divided private floor plans we are used to today. You were entering a single open-concept shared space, built strictly for survival. The walls were built using wattle and daub, a sturdy woven lattice of flexible hazel or willow branches, plastered thick with a binding mixture of mud, clay, animal hair, and cow poop. Once hardened, it was surprisingly strong and insulated, topped off by a steep, heavy thatched roof made of straw or water reeds. But the absolute first thing that would hit you upon entering wouldn't be the rustic building style. It would be a thick, stinging wall of wood smoke. There were no stone fireplaces or modern chimneys. Instead, right in the center of the room burned a huge open hearth fire. The smoke simply billowed up into the rafters, slowly filtering out through the porous thatch or a tiny gap in the roof. While this brilliantly preserved the slabs of salted bacon, dried fish, and herbs hanging from the crossbeams, it was a daily nightmare for human health. Modern archaeological digs of Anglo-Saxon remains consistently reveal lungs deeply scarred by a lifetime of constant smoke breathing. Yet this central fire was the beating, essential heart of the home, providing the only source of heat and the primary means of cooking. Hovering over the flames would be an iron cauldron or heavy clay pot continuously simmering with pottage, a thick, never-ending stew of barley, oats, beans, cabbage, and whatever tough meats were available meant to be scooped up with dense, gritty loaves of dark bread. Away from the blazing fire, the house was incredibly dim. Glass was a huge luxury, strictly reserved for high-status churches or monasteries. So the small, narrow windows were covered only by solid wooden shutters or stretched oiled animal skins that let in a dull, yellowish glow while fighting off the brutal winter drafts. When the sun went down, the shadows were pushed back by the sputtering weak light of rushlights, marsh rushes, dipped in smelly animal fat whose smell constantly mixed with the wood smoke. The floor beneath your leather shoes was hard-packed dirt insulated with a layer of woven straw rushes or bracken. Smart householders would crush sweet-smelling herbs like meadowsweet or mint into this floor covering to help hide the strong, unmistakable odor of everyday life. And that odor wasn't just human. In the biting cold of a 950s winter, you weren't just sharing this tight space with your extended family. You were sharing it with your livestock. In many rural longhouses, cows, prized pigs, or chickens were brought into a separated section of the house. Their huge body heat acted as a natural heater, essential for keeping everyone alive. Furniture was remarkably sparse. Heavy wooden chests for valuables that doubled as benches, a rough trestle table, and beds that were simply raised wooden platforms or the floor itself, softened by straw-stuffed linen sacks and heavily piled with scratchy woolen blankets and animal furs. It was cramped, incredibly smoky, and smelled of earth and beasts. But in an unforgiving world, this firelit room was the ultimate safe place. So, after surviving the grueling, back-breaking labor of plowing fields or forging iron all day, what did an Anglo-Saxon actually do to blow off steam in a world completely without screens, scrolling, or mass media? Entertainment in 950 AD was intensely social, surprisingly intellectual, and sometimes deeply physical. The absolute peak of their entertainment culture was the community gathering. While the average peasant couldn't feast like a king, local communities still gathered around the hearth to pass around intricately carved cattle horns, sloshing with honey-sweetened mead or thick, cloudy ale. But the true main event wasn't just the drinking, it was the storytelling. The Anglo-Saxons were deeply obsessed with the power of words. They didn't just casually chat, they engaged in high-stakes verbal gymnastics. A scop, a professional bard and storyteller, would captivate the firelit room by plucking the gut strings of a beautifully carved instrument, rhythmically chanting epic tales of legendary heroes, bloody monsters, and doomed battles, much like the famous story of Beowulf. When they weren't listening to sweeping epics, they were aggressively testing each other's wits. The Anglo-Saxons loved complex double-meaning riddles, many of which survive today in a famous 10th century manuscript called the Exeter Book, ranging from clever poetic metaphors about nature to surprisingly dirty jokes that would make a modern stand-up comedian blush. If you weren't in the mood for poetry, you would likely turn to the tabletop. Board games were fiercely popular across all ages and social classes. Men and women alike would hunch over wooden boards to play Ein Tafel, a deeply strategic asymmetric game often referred to as Viking chess, where a single king piece tries to escape a surrounding swarm of attackers. They also gambled relentlessly using dice painstakingly carved from deer antlers, walrus ivory, or sheep knuckles. Outside the smoky homes, hobbies were highly physical and often doubled as practical survival training. Young men engaged in brutal, no-holds-barred wrestling matches, weightlifting with heavy stones and foot races in the village meadows. Meanwhile, the wealthy elite obsessed over hunting. Hawking or falconry was the ultimate high-status hobby of the 950s, requiring immense patience and skill to train wild birds of prey to hunt small game. Ultimately, what makes the 950s so incredibly fascinating is that underneath the muck, the constant threat of violence, and the desperate daily struggle for survival, these were people who deeply craved joy, art, and intellectual stimulation. They laughed at crude jokes, debated fiercely over board games, and sang loud songs into the dark, freezing winter nights, proving that while the landscape and technology of 950 AD feel completely alien to us today, the fundamental human desire to gather together, share a drink, and tell a great story hasn't changed a single bit.